So the Biden administration is getting hit with questions about whether or not we are in a recession and is getting criticized for not just flatly admitting that we are. Wikipedia is getting accused of editing the definition of a recession. That seems to have been a bit of clickbait, and we want to get into what happened with that, because that's not exactly what happened, but something did happen. But first, I want to actually question the underlying assumption here that Democrats ought to be saying that we're not in a recession and Republicans ought to be celebrating that we are. And here's why. Because I think the Biden administration, if I were advising them, I'd say, yeah, we're in a recession, because that then sends a signal to the Fed that it's time to quit tapping the brakes on this economy, that the next time that the Board of Governors meets, there should not be any more interest rate increases, because if they continue to pump the brakes on the economy, we will plunge much deeper into a recession, if you believe that we're in one. And if they don't, then these 2 quarters of negative growth could be the last 2 quarters of negative growth, and you could see an upswing, perhaps in time for the midterms, but certainly in time for the general election. So I actually think they're missing the long and medium term benefits of acknowledging recession by kind of clinging to the short term pain that they feel like they might be able to avoid. What's your read?
That's a really good point, and I think it's because of the election year, and that's the best explanation that I can come up with for that. And what Ryan's TV was just doing was in the office, where they watch the screensaver to see if it'll ever fit neatly into the corner. The Samsung logo was like bouncing around. I was so excited for that, but you fixed it anyway. But my assumption is that they are avoiding it because they don't want to be hit with the stench of a recession president in a year where they're already frustrated about how the midterm cycle seems to be shaping up. And I was reading Nellie Bowles' newsletter for Common Sense, Barry Weiss's Substack, this morning. And to this point, she had an interesting kind of concise encapsulation of what's happening. She says, the media is ready to go carrying the administration's water. Here's the Associated Press. Quote, by one common definition, the economy shrinking for consecutive quarters, the U.S. economy is on the cusp of a recession, yet that definition isn't the one that counts. She goes and talks about the Wikipedia example. She says the economic historian Phil Magnus posted on Facebook about the White House word games with recession and got a warning, tagging it as, quote, false information and adding a fact check. So propaganda and media have obviously, this is not new, the confluence of government propaganda attempts and media kind of running with them when it serves their purpose and their ideology and their business, whatever it happens to be at that particular moment. But I feel like we're kind of in Orwell's world that he wrote about in Politics in the English Language, where we've gotten to a point where it's just like we don't agree on anything, and the only people that benefits are the people in power. And it's much different than the war propaganda, bad as it has been for decades. It seems to be creeping into absolutely every single aspect of our politics and our lives.
Yeah, and I think words that we even used to all commonly agree on the definition of are kind of losing their meanings as people contest them, from the right and the left for their own advantage. But it's also true that that this is a tricky one. That first of all, GDP is an insanely inexact number. You're literally trying to measure the output of an entire multi-trillion-dollar economy, like with the kind of precision that would then enable you to say that it's in a recession or it's not in a recession. So some of it is just is fundamentally contested, and so this kind of Wikipedia edit actually has some merit to it. That this is a contested claim. Now, Dean Baker, who's a kind of liberal economist, has been actually making an argument that it's absurd to say that we're in a recession. And here's the argument that he makes. He said, yes, if you want to go by two quarters of negative growth, fine. Like there are 2 quarters of stated negative growth. We'll see if there are revisions or whatever. What he points out is that there was this tweak. There have been tweaks to inventories, and so because of a slowing rate of growth in inventory accumulation, that knocked 2.01 percentage points off of the quarter's growth. There's still been growth in it, but not at the inventory accumulation rate that it was at before. That has to do with supply chains, easing up, and so with a 0.9% decline 2.01% moves it from positive to negative. And then you also have decline in residential construction that he says knocked 0.71% off GDP. I think that's fair. Like if residential housing is going down, you should knock it off. But so if you take away that 2 percentage points from this weird tweak in inventories, and the tweak in inventories, he argues, is actually economically a good sign, you get this weird confluence where a good thing happening in the economy actually winds up knocking 2 percentage points off GDP growth that moves it then under zero, which then gets people saying, well, we've now had two quarters of negative growth, and so therefore we're in a recession. He went through the rest of the growth and found, just look at some of it here. Consumption grew at 1%. The savings rate was up. The rate of inflation was down. Now down. It was at 5.2% last quarter. Now it's at a 4.4% annual rate, which is still above the target, but which is coming down. Investment was up. So lots of interesting good signs in the economy. The number that spits out is 0.9% down, and so then we all then tangle over whether or not, well, can we say that we're in a recession at this point?
That's why the Wikipedia, I have a completely contrarian take on this Wikipedia controversy as we're talking about it. If anything, and Wikipedia does have some formalized processes in the editing, but if anything, this sort of communal group approach to editing, granted they locked it, and that wasn't a communal decision, that was a Wikipedia decision. I think that's suspect. But the idea that you have the sort of online community working on the definition, because when you have the definition of a recession being one that is not concrete and is not particularly well outlined with boundaries we all agree on, it's the opposite from my perspective. It's like how the internet is supposed to work, that it's this kind of collaborative place where instead of having the government decide what the definition of a recession is, we can sort of hash it out. But then Wikipedia came in and locked it and said the previous iterations of the article were false, which is, again, that's another decision. That is a more centralized decision. It's not organic. But to your point, people don't give a damn what the formal economist-approved definition of a recession is. They know they're feeling it. They're feeling it in their bank accounts. They're feeling it when they go to pay bills right now. But what you're saying is that the definition of a recession actually does matter, because it matters in terms of how the Fed approaches its various mechanisms, which is, I think, really frustrating from the perspective of regular people in the country.
Right, and my big fear is that the Fed will push us beyond, will push interest rates so high that they will do what they did kind of in the early 2000s and drive the economy into a needless recession. And for people who haven't lived through those as professionals, they are, they make you nostalgic for the awful, terrible economy that we have that in booming times. When you have 6-7 people hunting for every job opening rather than 2 job openings for every job searcher. Your life becomes a lot more miserable at home and at work, because you get treated a lot worse at work. Your ability to form into a union. We just saw what Trader Joe's form a union in Massachusetts, a Trader Joe's store in Massachusetts form a union. All of that action, all of that progress is fueled by a tight labor economy, and the elites would like nothing more to have a much looser one where people are fighting each other, for scarce jobs. And so that's why I think that Democrats or progressives, at least, and populists should be like, okay, fine. Yeah, we're in a recession. Chill out, Fed. Yes, we're in a recession. Even if the numbers don't necessarily reflect that, and also, for instance, consumption of services, we're moving, as the economy is opening up, more and more people are getting back into services and getting away from all of the stuff that they've been buying on Amazon. During the pandemic, so much of our economy moved away from bars and restaurants and coffee shops and those sorts of things, that so much spending went into buying things that it really broke supply chains, combined with the labor shortage and combined with people not being able to show up for work because they were dying or because they had COVID. So last quarter consumption of services rose at a 4.1% annual rate, and hotel and restaurant spending rose at a 13.5% annual rate. And so, these are things that have to be taken into context with the negative rates that you see kicked around as well, because inventories going down is actually probably a good thing, because it means the economy is balancing out again. And if inventories going down are the thing that tipped the number into recession territory, then you have to wonder what kind of value that number has on an analytical basis.
Yeah, it's interesting because one thing that hosts in cable news and successful journalists have, they all have healthcare, they all have 401ks, and they feel the economy extremely different than other people do. And the media's coverage of the recovery from the Great Recession, I think, reflected that. Some of the coverage of the Trump economy, I think, reflected that, as we had that bifurcated situation where the stock market was going up and up and up. But if you didn't have money in the stock market, you were experiencing something very different, and that affects the way they cover these stories, I think, immensely. So, more information from my perspective and more debate over it is only a good thing. But it is, I think, always very interesting to watch how the administration takes how the media takes economic talking points from various administrations.
And before we go, have we put up the Wikipedia before and after? Because we can, if we haven't, let's put that up now. Then some people can pause the video and compare and contrast whether they think that this warrants the outrage that some are throwing at Wikipedia. I don't actually think so, because they're both, one is saying that in the UK, 2 quarters of negative growth is a recession, and in the US, here's the NEBR definition, and the other basically says the same thing, just moving the words around. I think it's interesting that it got locked, because that does show you that even Wikipedia is losing faith in the public to just contest these ideas in a good faith intellectual way. But I don't think it's fair to say that the edit was necessarily made makes it more favorable to the Biden administration.
Yeah, and Wikipedia has gotten increasingly politicized, and has given up on, I think, what its original mission was to some extent. But that doesn't mean, the benefit of Wikipedia is that there's still transparency, and you can at least see which direction that it's going in. So on that note, as Ryan said. Yeah, as Ryan said, you can pause and compare the screenshots back and forth and see for yourself. And we will be back with more Rising right after this.